Uh, the dominant discourse on development, which consciously or unconsciously all of us imbibe, roughly runs as follows: that there is a sector in the economy where there is low productivity, low labor productivity, overcrowding of people, low per capita incomes, and therefore poverty. Above all, this sector is a sector which I call petty production, of which peasant agriculture is, of course, the core, but additionally you have fishermen, craftsmen, artisans and others, all of whom suffer from the fact that they have low labor productivities, and as a result their incomes are low and they are afflicted by poverty. The idea of development is to shift this workforce from this low productivity sector to a high productivity sector, high labor productivity sector, which basically means the capitalist sector, because in the capitalist sector you have a certain technology that is used which entails larger labor productivity. Therefore, the whole idea of development is to shift people from low productivity, petty production sectors to high productivity capitalist sectors. Sometimes we may call it traditional, modern, but roughly in terms of property relations, we are talking about shift from low productivity, petty production sector to high productivity capitalist sector. Now, this is supposed to come about because of the fact that precisely owing to the overcrowding in the petty production sector, I said per capita incomes are low, you can actually get people coming out of that sector at a real wage rate that does not have to rise until some shortage of labor has begun to manifest itself. As long as you have this process of overcrowding going on, you actually have labor which is available at what you may call a subsistence wage, but a subsistence wage that's somewhat higher than the per capita incomes in these overcrowded sectors. But on the other hand, these wages don't have to rise. So at that wage, you keep drawing people out, and this can go on until it is the case that a sufficient amount of labor has been drawn out from the petty production sector, because of which labor shortages begin to appear in the economy, and that is when real wages start rising. Therefore, if the idea is to shift people out, then we have to make sure that the capitalist sector grows as rapidly as possible. Now, in the capitalist sector, I mentioned that the real wages are fairly low because, after all, people are being drawn from sectors with even lower per capita incomes, but labor productivity is high. Per person, therefore, the amount produced is much larger than the amount which accrues as wage, and consequently the surplus, which means output minus the wage bill, is much larger per person, consequently is much larger as a proportion of output, and therefore if this surplus is invested, you get a high ratio of investment in output and therefore a high growth rate. And consequently, if you get a high growth rate, this process of drawing people from the traditional petty production sector can actually continue merrily. What we have to therefore ensure, according to this perception, is that all facilities are provided, all the environment is created for the modern capitalist sector to grow rapidly. In other words, all impediments to capital accumulation have to be removed, and consequently all incentives have to be provided as far as capital accumulation is concerned. If in the process of capital accumulation, the capitalist sector makes some encroachments on the traditional sector, for instance, land is required for factories, And consequently, to build a factory, you would have to take over some land from the peasants, which basically displaces the peasants. Even if, therefore, the capitalist sector makes some encroachments on the traditional sector, it doesn't matter, because ultimately, after all, that's only a transitional pain. Ultimately, after all of them are going to be shifted to the capitalist sector. So these transitional pains should not bother us. The whole idea must be to ensure that the capitalist sector continues to grow rapidly, and that this sooner or later would bring about a shift of the workforce, which is the essence of development. Now, this is something which is both theoretically sustained by various growth theories, the most famous of which is by a Nobel Prize-winning economist called W. Arthur Lewis. It's called the Lewis model, very well known in economics. He actually built a picture of how this goes on. And it is also supposed to correspond to the experience of Western Europe. The idea is that this is exactly what happened in Western Europe. In Western Europe, in fact, the process of capitalist development was associated with heavy encroachments on the traditional production sectors. For instance, you had what are called enclosure movements. Basically, what happened was that the landlords enclosed common land, from which therefore large numbers of peasants were excluded, which made their economies unviable, and consequently these peasants could not sustain themselves anymore. They migrated to cities in search of jobs, and even though they suffered transitional pains, ultimately they were absorbed into the capitalist sector in the cities. This process of destruction of the petty production sector by the capitalist sector is something which was referred to by Marx as a process of primitive accumulation of capital. That it has a long history, fascinating history, which I don't have time to go into. But on the other hand, it has very deep philosophical implications and so on, which, if you like, in the question-answer session we can discuss. But it was called a process of primitive accumulation of capital. Incidentally, when I say philosophical implications, I mean it has a conceptual meaning which demarcates a socialist worldview from a liberal worldview. Anyway, so the point is that then those who were displaced, according to Marx, by this process of primitive accumulation of capital were people who were then absorbed into the capitalist sector. And that's what Western European experience is, and consequently that is something which we are going to replicate ourselves, and of course that is why all facilities for capital accumulation should be given. Now, this is, as I said, the dominant discourse on development, and most of us are exposed to it. Now, what I want to argue is that this discourse is wrong. And why it is wrong? It is wrong both theoretically, of course. If something is wrong, it must be wrong both theoretically and also historically. Let me begin with history. Historically, the fact that in Western Europe, large numbers of people who are thrown out of land, who came to the cities in search of employment, were absorbed into the expanding capitalist sector is a wrong conception. A very large number of them actually emigrated abroad. There was a huge emigration of Europeans to the temperate regions of European settlement, or if one is not too finicky, one can say quite frankly the temperate regions of white settlement, which was Canada, Australia, United States, New Zealand, South Africa, and such like. According to, again, a figure given by Arthur Lewis, who's an economic historian of great eminence, 50 million Europeans migrated from Europe to the temperate regions of white settlement during what can be called the long 19th century, which actually ends with the First World War. During that entire period, 50 million Europeans migrated. We have plenty of time, so I'll just make digressions from time to time. The 19th century was quite remarkable. In the 19th century, there were two massive streams of migration. There was one massive stream of migration of Indians and Chinese labor, Chinese coolie labor, Indian indentured labor, which was again of the same order of magnitude. 50 million Indians and Chinese migrated, but they migrated roughly from from tropical and subtropical regions to other tropical and subtropical regions. They were not allowed to migrate to the temperate regions. But there was a temperate migration from Europe to the temperate regions, and these two streams of migration were kept strictly separate. One was a low-wage migration of Indian indentured laborers, Chinese labor, coolie laborers, and so on, and the other was a high-wage migration. It was high-wage migration because of the fact that those who were migrating, they actually got rid of the local population, evicted from their land. The Amerindians got hold of the land, set themselves up as farmers, and consequently enjoyed a higher standard of living, which therefore also pushed up the wage rate back home. In other words, you had the creation of some kind of tightness in the labor market, the strengthening of the trade union movement in Europe, all of which became possible because of this huge scale of migration. So the fact that you had people who were originally displaced from petty production apparently getting absorbed into capitalist production, and therefore the conclusion that capitalism first destroys petty production, then absorbs everybody who is thereby thrown out, is a conclusion which is not legitimate, because there is nothing that necessarily ensures this, and that was not the European experience. Just to give you some idea of the scale, from Britain, for instance, between the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 and 1910, that entire long period, the number of people who migrated was much larger than the original population. In fact, one can say that roughly every year, half the increase in population migrated, which basically means that the number of migrants was half the number, that is the increase in population. If you think of a similar scale of migration from India, then since independence, 40 crore Indians should have migrated. Now, obviously, that is something which is no longer possible in today's context. Therefore, this whole idea, and incidentally, those petty producers who were displaced by capitalism in the colonies and semi-colonies like India, China, and so on, they were not a part of this migration stream, and they remained unemployed, underemployed, a massive kind of labor reserve. And that is the origin of modern mass poverty. So the point is that this reading of history, it doesn't matter that people may get displaced for the time being, but on the other hand, sooner or later they'll get absorbed, is a reading which is not correct. I should say that this reading is one which is shared by some people whom I greatly admire, including my own teacher, Professor Amartya Sen, who had actually said at the time that when the Nandigram and so on was happening, he said that, when London and Manchester were built, peasants were also displaced. implying that, look, I mean, these things happen. But on the other hand, history doesn't stop because of that, and those people who are displaced do not remain destitute forever. They get absorbed, their conditions improve and so on. So therefore we shouldn't worry too much. But as a matter of fact, we have to worry, because those who are displaced by the building of London and Manchester were not absorbed into factories around London and Manchester. They had the possibility of migrating abroad, which those who would be displaced by things like Nandigram today would not have the possibility of. Theoretically, again, this reading of development is not correct for a very simple reason. This reading of development suggests that in the capitalist sector, there is a certain labor productivity. Let us take some numerical example, simple numerical example to make the point, namely that suppose it is the case that every worker in the capitalist sector produces 100 units and gets a wage which is 50 units, then 50% is a proportion of surplus, and suppose you have all of it being invested, 50% is your investment ratio, in which case you can have a growth rate correspondingly. The idea is that if you maintain this technology, then of course over a period of time, the high growth rate generated by 50%, I mean, I don't know how many of you are economic students, but the growth rate is supposed to be, the investment ratio multiplied by the, or divided by what is called the incremental capital output ratio. If the incremental capital output ratio is 4 or 5, let us say, a 50% investment ratio gives you 10% growth rate. Maintain 10% growth rate, then over a period of time, everybody would get absorbed. What this misses is that in the modern sector, in the capitalist sector, there is continuous technological progress taking place. The essence of that technological progress is an increase in labor productivity. As a result, you don't have a given labor productivity, you have a continuous increase in labor productivity. Now, if you have a continuous increase in labor productivity, let us assume growth rate remains at 10%. Okay? The increase in employment growth rate, this is an algebraic truism, that employment growth rate plus labor productivity growth rate is equal to output growth rate. Okay? So if you have a 10% output growth rate, and if you have a labor productivity growth rate of 9%, then your employment would increase only at 1%. Okay? If your workforce is increasing at 1.5%, in that case, you would find that not only would you not be able to draw anybody from the traditional sector, the capitalist sector would not even be able to absorb the increase in workforce occurring within itself. Okay. Now, in such a case, therefore, you would have a situation where there is never any absorption of labor reserves. You actually would have growing unemployment and underemployment that takes place. You can have a high growth rate, but if the high growth rate is accompanied by a high rate of growth of labor productivity, then the employment growth rate is correspondingly smaller, and when the employment growth rate is correspondingly smaller, if it is less than the workforce growth rate, then you'd never be able to absorb the labor reserves, to absorb those low productivity workers. On the contrary, actually their relative size in the economy would actually be increasing. Therefore, you would have more and more people getting crowded into such sectors, because after all, people can't get crowded into the capitalist sector. Nobody would be given an income unless you are a bona fide worker. And consequently, you would have growth rate of 10% taking place, but as a matter of fact, this would be accompanied by growing absolute poverty. So you can have growth taking place together with growing absolute poverty. Now, this is something which is so little understood that very often you find that a lot of people, well-known leaders, writers, and so on, they actually talk about how important it is for us to raise the rate of growth of labor productivity. As a matter of fact, if you keep raising the rate of growth of labor productivity, then your capacity to absorb labor is correspondingly reduced. There is a second factor that actually enters the picture here, and that is the following. And that is the following. Suppose you actually have a high growth rate, the capitalist sector is not absorbing the labor, not absorbing the rate of growth of the workforce. What is happening? Your wages remain at the same subsistence level because no tightness has been created in the labor market. At the same time, your labor productivity is going on increasing. Per worker, therefore, while wages remain the same, you find that surplus is rising, and therefore is rising as a proportion of output. Therefore, income distribution is shifting from the workers to the surplus earners, which is basically an inegalitarian shift in income distribution. Now, typically what happens is that suppose you give a worker a rupee, the worker or peasant or whatever, peasant drawn to the workforce, you give a rupee and that person would go and spend the rupee buying something, maybe buying some essential gadget for home or whatever. If you give the same rupee to a relatively better off person, then that person would perhaps go and have a holiday in French Riviera, or perhaps order some kind of more sophisticated goods and gadgets whose employment intensity is much smaller. I'll give you an example. For 5 years I was in Kerala working in the planning board. MGNREGS, this Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme was going on. So I would go occasionally to visit MGNREGS sites. And one of the things I would always ask is, the income that you have got, what do you do with it? And a lot of them would say that, that dosa paste is made with stone grinders, that they bought the stone grinder with last month's income and so on. Now that grinder is produced in the next village. That grinder is not imported from France, and that grinder is something which actually requires substantial amount of labor input, unlike, let us say, some other gadgets where the employment intensity is smaller. The point I'm trying to make is that, therefore, a shift in income distribution, which is inegalitarian in nature, itself implies a change in the production structure that actually raises labor productivity. Okay. If so, then there is a certain labor productivity that I gave an example, 10% growth rate, let's say 9% growth of labor productivity, which is the base rate of increase in labor productivity, 1% increase in employment, not enough to absorb the workforce growth, which is 1.5%. But because of this, there is a secondary factor, that is income distribution becomes unequal, because of which the labor productivity growth then remains not just 9%, it goes beyond 9%, becomes 9.5%, because the income distribution brings about a secondary kind of shift, a structural change implying an increase in labor productivity. And if so, then the capacity of the growth rate to absorb labor declines over time. And that being the case, if you have a high growth rate, then that high growth rate not only does not absorb labor to start with, but if it does not absorb labor sufficiently to start with, in other words, if the rate of labor absorption is less than the rate of growth of the workforce, then matters become worse and worse and worse and worse. Okay. Then it will never be able to absorb, and you find that employment generation actually tends to dwindle for any given rate of growth of output. Now, if you add to it a third factor, namely, which we have been talking about, namely the capitalist sector making encroachments on the pre-capitalist sector in the form of land. I mean, if you have income inequality rising, then those who get the surplus might wish to play golf. Then you have to build a golf course. Now, you build a golf course by taking over some land, and quite often it can be land which is, let's say, even assuming a single cropped, it implies an encroachment of the capitalist sector on the petty production sector. Okay, golf course may be an extreme example, airport. A lot of what we call so-called infrastructure investment is really investment which becomes essential because of the fact that income inequalities have been increasing. Large numbers of people are traveling by air. And if they travel by air, you need airports. I'm not saying anybody is morally responsible or at fault for this, but this is a phenomenon, it's a fact of life. And as a result, you'd find that it will make greater and greater encroachments on the pre-capitalist sector, and that being the case, there would be therefore a further strengthening of this tendency of growth at one pole, producing poverty at another pole, producing increasing poverty at another pole. Now, lest you think that all this is just kind of, imaginary constructions, I would like to give you a couple of figures. You see, one of the things, India, as you know, is a country which apparently has been having very high growth rates. Everybody keeps talking about the fact that now we are growing even faster than China and so on. But at the same time, it's a well-known fact that in India, poverty measured in terms of nutrition is actually in absolute poverty, measured in terms of a base nutritional norm, is actually increasing over time. In India, poverty is defined as follows. In urban areas, anybody who does not access 2,100 calories per person per day is considered poor. In rural areas, anybody who does not access 2,200 calories per person per day is considered poor. If you are below those norms, you are considered poor. Remember, these are absolute norms, okay? Now, if you look at the proportion of people who actually, let's say in rural India, did not access 2,200 calories per person per day, that proportion in 1993-94 was 58% of the total population. You look at the same proportion in, I said 1993-4, you look at the same proportion in 2011-12, which is the latest year for which we have data, 68%. So a substantial increase in the proportion of population in rural India that does not access a basic, absolutely defined calorie norm. In urban areas, the figures for 2 years correspondingly, respectively, are 57% and 65%. So we have this absurd situation where we have very high growth rates, but on the other hand, these very high growth rates are accompanied by the definitions of the government itself. These norms and so on are not my definition, they're the government's own definition. These definitions by the government themselves, if you proceed according to those definitions, there is an increase in absolute poverty precisely in this period when we appear to be having very high rates of growth. Now, when this is pointed out, the standard argument that is put forward against this is that, to get rid of this poverty, then what we require is still higher growth rates. That, okay, even 9% or 10% growth rate, that's my example, is not enough. What we require is 12, 13, 14% growth rates. But what is missed is the fact that when the growth rate rises, with it the growth rate of labor productivity also rises. And what is more, when the growth rate rises, likewise the encroachments on petty production also rises. And as a result, it is something which acts both ways. Certainly, a rise in the growth rate would, other things remaining the same, have a greater impact on the demand for labor, but on the other hand, it also releases more labor wanting employment because it encroaches on petty production. And therefore, this whole idea that growth rate increase is somehow the panacea for overcoming poverty is an idea which is wrong, or which is not necessarily true, and what is more, the original conception of development which characterizes the entire dominant development discourse in our country is both historically inaccurate and theoretically ill-founded. If so, then what can we think of as an alternative? Now, when you think of it this way, the idea that sooner or later the whole petty production sector would be removed and people working there would all be absorbed in high productivity capitalist sector is a proposition which is not correct, not necessarily correct. If it's not necessarily correct, then the idea is that we somehow have therefore got to defend, protect, and promote the petty production sector. That means that we have to defend, promote, and protect peasant agriculture above all, because in India, roughly half of the total workforce, including peasants and agricultural laborers, is still employed in the agricultural sector. And consequently, the idea of development as consisting of shifting that workforce to capitalist industry or modern sector is an idea, no matter how good it may be if it could be done, simply cannot be put into practice. And consequently, you have to think in terms of developing peasant agriculture and the petty production sector where it is, protecting it from the vicissitudes of world market price fluctuations, providing it with credit, ensuring that there is a high rate of growth of output in that particular sector whereby incomes begin to increase, so you have to directly intervene there. The second thing which you have to do, which is an interesting and important thing, is that there has to be some control on the pace of technological structural change. Let me just explain what I mean by this, because this is something which is not often appreciated, but the two most brilliant thinkers of Asia in the 20th century, one was Mao Zedong and the other was Gandhi, they both thought along these lines. When Mao was talking about backyard steel, he actually had in mind the fact that we don't get rid of the backyard production. On the contrary, we actually encourage backyard production. When Gandhi was talking about protecting handloom or protecting even hand spinning, he was really talking about having restrictions on the pace of technological change. Now, this is something which is commonly rejected, including, by the way, on the left. And the argument is the following. Let me begin with the argument on the left. The argument on the left is the following. Picture a world in which there's a doubling of labor productivity. Okay? If you can have a world in which we have work sharing and product sharing, okay? In that case, what you can do is that the same output is produced, but simply employ half the workforce. Everybody, let us say, works half the time. Therefore, leisure increases. But the fact that leisure increases does not mean that people take less. They get the same amount of output. Okay, so the output, say 100 output was originally being produced by 100 people, and now it requires only 50 people to produce with the same working hours. Then you keep the 100, reduce everybody's working hour by half, and make sure that each gets the same amount as that they got earlier. So in a work sharing, product sharing economy, there should be no reason why there has to be any constraint on technological progress. But on the other hand, suppose you don't have a work-sharing, product-sharing economy in that, and that is the left argument, namely that, look, in a socialist economy there need be no controls on the pace of technological progress because it would be a work-sharing, product-sharing economy. High technological progress simply would give greater freedom to people to write poetry or to go on holidays or to kind of whatever. So, the thing is that if we are not in such a world, and we are not in such a world, then even to absorb labor, it becomes important to make sure that when you're having the 10% growth rate, your labor productivity is not growing at 9%, it is growing maybe at 5%. So you must have some control on the rate of growth of labor productivity through control over the pace of structural cum technological change. Now, all of us, in a way, implicitly understand this when we oppose, for instance, the entry of Walmart into India. What is the argument? That Walmart is going to throw large numbers of small traders and shopkeepers and so on out of business. So we are actually saying that control the pace of structural change or technological change, let the old shopkeepers continue, but let us not get all these sophisticated things like Walmart that entail much higher levels of labor productivity. So in an intuitive sense, all of us at some point or the other subscribe to this view, but I think we should do so consciously. And of course, Gandhi was very, very clear about it, that in fact he said that, the correspondence he had with Tagore was one in which this issue was discussed. And one of the points that Tagore raised is that, look, it's true you are saying that if there is a control on technological change, what you're saying is true. But on the other hand, the quality of products that, let us say, come out of mills is much superior to the quality of products that come out from the local handloom weaver and so on. To which Gandhi's reply was that, why should I wear the fineries produced in Bond Street if my brother, the weaver next door, is starving as a consequence of it? So I think he was obviously thinking in terms of putting controls on structural and technological change, not necessarily state control, but in a voluntary control, but on the other hand, this is something which can be also part of a policy. And as a matter of fact, many people do not realize that, whenever we think of a capitalist economy, all capitalist economies are characterized by the existence of unemployment. In fact, capitalist economies never, except during years of war, have actually ever experienced shortage of labor or tightness, full employment, strictly speaking. But on the other hand, the only countries which actually witnessed labor shortage were the former socialist countries, Soviet Union, Eastern Europe, and so on. Why did they? Why did they experience shortage of labor? In fact, one of the critics of socialism, a very distinguished Hungarian economist called János Kornai, actually says that really one of the fundamental difference between the socialist and the capitalist economies consisted in this. The main reason that, in my view, they actually experienced labor shortage is, apart from the fact that they had high rates of output growth rate, they actually control the pace of technological progress. They control the pace of growth of labor productivity. Because of which, no doubt, as Gandhi had said in response to Tagore, some of their products were shoddy. All these jokes about Soviet goods being no good compared to American goods are of course quite valid, but on the other hand, that was the price to be paid for ensuring that everybody in society was actually employed. In fact, they actually had labor shortages which drew women into the workforce in large numbers, brought about very significant changes in the family structure and in the social structure of those countries. Anyway, so it seems to me that we have to think in terms of some controls on the pace of technological change. This is not to say that we should have controls everywhere. I don't see why, for instance, certain certain frontier technologies, for instance, in medical practice, in surgery, should not be here. But there can be all kinds of other sectors where it makes less difference, and in those sectors, we can, in Walmart is a very obvious example. In those sectors, we can think in terms of controls on technological and structural change. The third thing we have to think of is that, okay, we are thinking in terms of protecting and preserving the petty production sector. Okay, protecting and preserving, I mean, I should say that if you think in terms of that, then that is something which goes against the fundamental tendency of neoliberal capitalism, which is to make encroachments on the petty production sector. But on the other hand, this is something which is required socially if we are ever going to get rid of poverty and, I mean, unemployment and therefore poverty. But then are we going to forever remain stuck in a world of petty production? You know, the world of petty production that characterizes India or characterizes many third world countries is not a particularly beautiful world. It's not a particularly pretty world. It's a world which is also characterized by the caste system. It's a world that is also characterized by extreme oppression, by a fragmentation of the people and so on. In fact, one can think in terms of pre-capitalist societies everywhere, not just here, constituting a community. Many people talk about the village community in India, constituting a community, but it's not a, it's a community into which you are born. It's not a community that you necessarily adopt. It's not a community of choice. You're born into it. Okay, I'm born into a village, I'm born into a particular family, and so be it. But on the other hand, capitalism destroys that community. And the argument which Marx had put forward, the vision that Marx had, is that capitalism creates a new kind of community because it brings together workers from diverse backgrounds, all of whom, in fact, then fight together for higher wages, for through combinations, trade unions and so on, and therefore develop a new kind of community. But this community is one which is a community of choice. You know, it's not a community into which you're born. It's not a community into whose oppressions you are conditioned from birth, but it's a community that you voluntarily create for yourself. So, in a sense, are we then saying that we've remained forever doomed into a world in which petty production continues, in which the narrowness of thought, mind that characterizes village society is something that continues? I would say not. And as a result, what I would suggest is that while protecting and promoting petty production, we have to make efforts so that, in a sense, not only is it the case that people are drawn out of it, but what is more, petty production itself becomes larger in terms of scale through voluntary cooperativization, through voluntarily petty producers coming to form cooperatives and collectives. So the scale of production does not always remain small. And in such a case, you can even think in terms of industrialization occurring on the basis of peasant cooperative owned industries or peasant collective owned industry, etc. But a precondition for that is, of course, overcoming the existing inequalities that characterize the sector. And one very important way in which it needs to be overcome, social inequalities, of course, we know, but one very important way in which it can be overcome is through land redistribution. In the neighborhood of Delhi, for a very long period of time, land redistribution is not just an economic demand. In the neighborhood of Delhi and in large parts of India, for a very long time, Dalits were never allowed to own land. So land redistribution, so that they acquire ownership of some land, is also a blow against traditional caste society. So land redistribution not only has an economic dimension and not only creates the conditions for, at a later stage, a voluntary coming together of peasants into larger units without one segment dominating the other, but it is also something which has a very important social role to play. Now, one can go on, but I don't want to, it seems to me that this alternative trajectory, which one can discuss about, which one can refine, which one can modify, this alternative trajectory is one which is diametrically opposed to the trajectory we are following under neoliberal capitalism. In a nutshell, the trajectory we are following under neoliberal capitalism believes in destroying petty production with the promise that someday all these people are going to get absorbed anyway. They are not going to get absorbed, and consequently any alternative trajectory must proceed on the assumption that they are not going to be absorbed, and therefore it becomes very important to improve, protect and promote their conditions of production where they currently are, and then build the development around that. Now, this is something which is of a general kind. In other words, this is something which has to be debated among economists and so on. But on the other hand, until this debate is over, and it will never get over by its very nature, what do we do? How do we actually try and ensure that something happens, that we move towards a denouement of some kind? And I would suggest here a certain kind of thing which maybe lawyers can think about, budding lawyers like yourselves can think about, and that's the following. That you see, the modern India is based on the presumption that compared to the millennia of institutionalized social inequality, social and economic inequality that we had, institutionalized inequality we are going to create a fraternity of equal citizens. I mean, that's the basic idea underlying our constitution, and that's the basic idea which was first put forward in 1931 in a resolution of the Karachi session of the Indian National Congress, which for the first time presented a picture of what free India, post-independence India, is going to look like. By the way, that picture contained things which to this day remain unrealized. Of course, it mentioned equality before law, it enforced it envisaged universal adult franchise as the basis for electing governments, it envisaged a secular government where the state has no religion, secular state. It envisaged a set of fundamental rights. It envisaged also free and compulsory primary education, which we still don't have. And it envisaged an abolition of the death penalty. The 1931 Karachi Congress resolution happened just a few days after the execution of Bhagat Singh. And as a result, it was in people's minds, and they said in free India, there would be no death penalty at all. Unfortunately, that still has not been realized, and to this day, death penalty not only continues, but there are demands and even realization of some of these demands of widening death penalty to a larger number of crimes. So, the Karachi Congress resolution visualized a fraternity of equal citizens. Now, of course, and this was carried over in the Indian Constitution. But of course, a fraternity of equal citizens cannot be created if you have a fundamental economically inequalizing tendency. And as I mentioned, if you don't draw people out from these overcrowded sectors, in that case you find that the proportion of surplus rises in output, and proportion of surplus rising is basically implies that there is a rise in income inequality. I need hardly say, all of you would be aware from reading newspapers and so on, that the level of inequality in India today is higher than it has ever been in modern times. For instance, Piketty has made this estimate, this French economist with a colleague has made this estimate from income tax data that ever since the Income Tax Act began, from which you get the data, the proportion of total income which goes to the top 1% of the population is higher today than it has ever been. Likewise, on wealth inequality, as you know, that the top 1%, this is not Piketty, this is Credit Suisse data, top 1% of households own 60% of total wealth of the households, and it's rising at the margin because apparently in 2016-17, the top 1% owned 73% of the additions to wealth in that year. So if you hold a larger proportion of the additions to the wealth compared to your average share, then of course your average share is rising. So you have sharp inequalities. Now the rise in inequalities is fundamentally inimical to the conception of a fraternity of equal citizens. Now if that is the case, then it becomes important that actually this conception of a fraternity of equal citizens must be imbued with greater meaning. That it's not enough for citizens to have some political rights and equality before law and so on, but in my view they must also have a set of justiciable universal economic rights. In our constitution, as you know, all the economic things are put into the directive principles of state policy. They are not rights. But why can we not think in terms of expanding the Bill of Rights to include a set of economic rights in which 5 minimal rights which I would like to incorporate: a right to food, right to employment, and failing the provision of employment, right to a wage rate that you would have got had you been employed, a right to quality, publicly funded, free healthcare along the lines of a national health service, for instance, a right to free, quality, publicly funded education, and of course a right to old age pension and disability benefits. A simple calculation which I had once made, a very rough calculation would suggest that in realizing all these rights would approximately cost about 10% of India's GDP. Let us assume that all these rights are actually put in place and this 10% of GDP, all of which is raised through taxation. Now that's not necessary, that's an exuberant assumption, because obviously, for instance, if you have a right to education, you need school buildings. When you have to build school buildings, you provide employment. So right to employment partly gets realized when you are going in search of the right to education. So there are complementarities of that kind. But suppose all of it has to be raised through taxes. Even so, India today has a tax GDP ratio which is about 16%. That will become 26%, which is no higher than that of most capitalist countries. Even the United States doesn't have has a tax GDP ratio approximately of that kind. Of course, Europe has much higher tax GDP ratios because of the welfare state measures introduced by European social democracy. So the country can easily afford it. I suggested an alternative development trajectory. But in order to even bring that alternative development trajectory into realization, we have to have a point of intervention. And I think a point of intervention can be to demand a set of universal justiciable economic rights that every citizen of India must have, and only then would it be possible for us to say with some justification that we are in the direction of creating a fraternity of equal citizens. Thank you, I'll stop there.
And my basic question was this: it is seen that in the Indian agricultural sector, there is a surplus of labor, and that often leads to disguised unemployment. So my question is, if they are not able to find proper employment in the agricultural sector and the industrial sector not able to absorb them and they cannot migrate somewhere else, what solution do these people have?
Yeah, good. Can I just take 3-4 questions together? That will just save a bit of time.
Good morning, sir.
I'm Suchismita. I'm a faculty in BITS Pilani Hyderabad campus. Sir, you spoke about control can be a part of policy. Right, when we were explaining Gandhian idea of controlling. So, I mean, can you please elaborate on that?
Can you just tell me again? I didn't quite catch.
Control can be a part of policy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's individual control, yes, we can voluntarily do that. But when it comes to policy making and we are doing such control, how it will work? Like, you can give example of ban of this plastic bags by Maharashtra government or something like that. But I mean, in large scale policies, how we can do that?
Right. Okay. I'll take one more or 2 more. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. My name is Lavanya. I too teach at BITS Pilani. I have 2 ideas. One is when you were talking about primitive accumulation, you talked about a democratic, a socialist worldview, and you said you could expand on it. I really would like you to expand on that. And actually, my second question builds on what Suchismita just said. When you talked about control of technology, the problem with control of technology would be that it would require a very centralized system. And technology, as it's developing, is becoming this highly empowering, open source form of equalizing in a very different way. But the thing is, access to it is what is not equal. And hence, again, it leads to further inequality. So wouldn't it be better to imagine, rather than control of technology, equitable access to different forms of technology and more open source movements as we're seeing today?
Should I? One more, okay. And then.
Sir, I am Abhyuday from the first year. I had a question that if we do not attempt to move workers outside from the petty production market to the modern capitalist sector, wouldn't we simply restrict ourselves to an era of stagnation and not growth? Because the petty production sector is inherently overpopulated and not productive.
Yeah, fine. That's similar to the first question. Yeah, all right. What do we do? That's a very important question, yours and the first one, whoever asked that, what do we do about agriculture? What do we mean by protecting and promoting and so on? Very important question. You see, there are 2 concepts of productivity. One is labor productivity, the other is land productivity. Okay. Now, in economies like ours, the magnitude of land is something which is, the natural amount of land is more or less given. I mean, I don't think you can expand the net sown area in India too much anymore. Okay. That was the case in medieval India. You could actually have unutilized land lying around, but that's no longer the case. It follows, therefore, that if you are thinking in terms of agricultural growth has to occur through an increase in land productivity. Okay. An increase in land productivity is what economists call land augmenting practices. In other words, it amounts to as if land supply is being augmented. How? Irrigation, which gives rise to multiple cropping, is one way of land augmentation. Increase in land yields through, for instance, high-yielding varieties of seeds is one way of land augmentation. Now, the Green Revolution was one way of land augmentation. So the whole idea is really to have land augmenting practices through which you can raise the rate of agricultural growth. If you do so, then within agriculture itself you would be able to absorb more people. In other words, labor productivity does not change, but if land productivity rises, then employment rises. Given land area, land productivity rises, output rises, labor productivity doesn't change, therefore employment rises. So, the way of actually, when I was talking about protecting, promoting petty production, particularly peasant agriculture, what I had in mind is that land productivity has got to be augmented. Now, one of the things in countries like ours is, it's another quite fascinating point, is that measures of increase in land productivity typically require state intervention. Not just today, even going back earlier. In fact, there's a very interesting remark by Karl Marx who says that all these countries like India and Asian countries, they basically had in medieval times 3 ministries. One is the Ministry of War, which is plundering from others. The other is Ministry of Revenue, which is plundering from your own people. And the third is Ministry of Irrigation. That irrigation was something which essentially had to be provided or supervised by the state because it required large irrigation works. A German writer, very well-known writer, on the basis of this, he was actually belonged to the German Communist Party, became ex and anti-communist later on. He wrote a book called Oriental Despotism, whose argument precisely was this, that precisely because in Oriental societies, irrigation is so important, and precisely because for irrigation, the state is so important, you actually required all these despotic empires and so on. Anyway, so, which has been much critiqued, but I mean, so forget that. But the point is that state is very important for land augmentation measures. Green revolution wouldn't have been possible if you did not have massive deployment of credit through nationalization of banks, if you did not have HIV seeds which were developed in publicly funded research laboratories, if you did not have expansion of irrigation, if you did not have procurement, assured procurement at remunerative prices, and so on and so forth. So the role of the state is very important in land augmentation and raising agricultural production, certainly in Asian conditions, certainly in Indian conditions. Now, one of the things about neoliberal capitalism is that the state increasingly withdraws from these measures. Public investment in rural infrastructure, irrigation and so on has declined, certainly declined quite sharply as a proportion of GDP. Then you find that public procurement certainly has disappeared in cash crops. In food crops is still there, but in cash crops is completely disappeared, which is why you find, these sharp crashes in prices, no protection against world market price fluctuations. You find that really, even though you have nationalized banks still, who are supposed to give priority sector credit to agriculture, they don't actually do that. And much of the agricultural sector now is dependent upon a new class of money lenders who actually charge exorbitant interest rates. One of the things that Swaminathan Commission had recommended is that credit actually should be given by nationalized banks at 4% interest rate, but that's not happening, etc. So the withdrawal of the state and the neoliberal capitalism is something that has actually kind of harmed this whole process of land augmentation, which is why agricultural growth rate has slowed down. And of course, this is manifest in the fact that per capita, you just make a very simple calculation. I made this calculation for the last 4 years, let us say. Consider the gross value added in agriculture divide in current prices, divide it by the agriculture dependent population. Agriculture dependent population we don't have every year, but 4 years is too short a period. We can assume that it increases at the same rate as the population as a whole, because in 4 years you don't have massive structural shifts. Therefore, you get per capita gross value added at current prices, deflated by a consumer price index number. And you find that in real terms, there is a decline over these 4 years. So that means per capita real income of the agriculture dependent population, and mind you, that's half the India's population, half the workforce, is actually declined, even when we are talking about we have a growth rate higher than China, this, that and the other. So, basic answer to both questions, the first one as well as the last one, is that when I'm talking about defense, protection, promotion of petty production sector, I'm not talking about simply it being left as it is. I'm talking about the state playing a role, initiating land augmenting measures that would increase incomes. All right, then there was a question about control can be a part of policy, but you must realize that that is what things were. In other words, there was mills in India were not allowed to manufacture certain things which were reserved for the decentralized sector. So these controls are not new. These controls have existed in India. Similarly, when you have, after all of Walmart does not exist or did not exist in India. We actually had the chap next door, the kind of, petty shopkeeper and so on. So the point is, and they were not allowed to enter into India earlier. So we had a set of policies of control, but of course they have been given up, as I said, under neoliberal capitalism. One of the things that neoliberal capitalism does is to remove all constraints on the pace of structural technological change. It does so on the premise that, look, it doesn't matter because they are going to be absorbed anyway, but they don't get absorbed, and because you have removed all these things, actually you produce growth at one pole and poverty at another. So control can be a part of policy. Control has been a part of policy. Gandhiji, of course, was talking about colonial times in which we didn't have an independent state, but he was talking about people themselves voluntarily rejecting foreign goods, voluntarily rejecting mill goods, but actually buying locally produced goods. But of course, now that we have an independent state, people's voluntary rejection can actually be supplemented by appropriate policy measures. All right, there was a question about primitive accumulation of capital, socialist versus liberal. Okay, I'll come to that. Centralized system, control over technology. You see, I'm talking about control of technology from one particular perspective. And that perspective is employment. All talk about eliminating poverty means nothing unless you actually eliminate unemployment. And I distinguish between unemployment on the one hand and leisure on the other hand. I was talking about work sharing, product sharing. That's a different thing. But the point is that you actually have massive unemployment. In India, this unemployment manifests itself differently. You see, it's not as if some people are fully employed, some people are fully unemployed. What you actually have is that larger and larger number of people are getting part-time employment, casual employment, intermittent employment, and so on. So that it's not as if 90 people are employed and 10 people are unemployed, but everybody on average is employed only 90% of the time. Okay, but that does not mean that the problem of unemployment is any less serious. Mind you, there's a lot of debate, as you must have seen in newspapers and so on, about employment has gone up and this and that. But you see, the concept of unemployment is a very tricky one. During the 1930s, when there was a Great Depression, a lot of people who are unemployed, who got thrown out of their work, set themselves up as shoe shine people by the roadside. Okay, so they would shine shoes. Now, you could say that there's no unemployment. There's a massive boom in employment in the shoe shine sector. Because where is the unemployment? They have simply moved elsewhere. But Joan Robinson developed her concept of disguised unemployment to take care of that particular situation. So the thing is that, therefore, unemployment doesn't necessarily show itself as unemployment. Nobody just sits at home, hands in pockets, saying, I'm unemployed. Then they go and do all kinds of things. And then it may appear that they're employed, but as a matter of fact, they're unemployed in disguise. Okay. Therefore, it's very difficult to calculate what is unemployment. But let me just give you one thing. In India, the National Sample Survey has a category which says, do you consider yourself to be employed? This is a question which is actually asked to many people, and there's a category which captures this. Now, if you look at that category as in some sense capturing, I'm not vouching for it, but in some sense capturing the authentic increase in employment, then you find that between 2004-5 and 9-10 years in which India was having very high growth rates, you remember, the rate of growth of employment in that sense was 0.9% per year. Okay, when we're having 9% growth rate of output. Your population is growing at 1.5%. Your workforce is growing at approximately a similar figure, and therefore the rate of growth of authentic employment is way below the population growth rate and the workforce growth rate. So that's the kind of situation I was talking about, in which case you actually have growth at one pole with growing poverty at another. Now, I was talking about control over technology only in that sense, namely that there are large numbers of areas in which one can intervene to slow down. I mentioned that the old socialist countries used to prevent the pace of technological structural change. How? Suppose a mine became unprofitable, they wouldn't close it down. Okay, that is preventing the pace of structural change. So things of that kind, because the miners would get unemployed. So you let the miners continue in their employment, even though the mine is not necessarily profitable. So one has to think in terms of this. You raised a very important question. Yes, of course, it may bring down the growth rate, but so what? In other words, if growth rate is accompanied by a growth in poverty, in that case it's very important to have a kind of growth which may not be as high statistically. In fact, nobody knows what the statistical growth rate currently is. There are all kinds of doubts, service sector and so on. But on the other hand, it is very important for us to think in terms of poverty elimination, which is the priority. I must tell you, John Stuart Mill, when he was writing, there was a lot of concern at that time. For some reason, economics in that period was very concerned with the notion of a stationary state. Everybody was worried that the economy would get stuck in a stationary state with zero growth rate. To which John Stuart Mill's reply was that, listen, I don't mind if the economy gets caught in a stationary state, provided the workers in it are better off than what they are now. Okay. Similarly, we should not bother about the growth rate as such. We should really bother about eliminating unemployment and poverty. Finally, this question about socialism and liberalism. Yeah. This is basically my own kind of reading. Yeah. If I live long enough, I might try and write about it. Okay, you see, Adam Smith, who, as you know, was the founder of modern political economy, had a notion. A lot of Marx is actually in response to Adam Smith. Adam Smith had a notion called the original accumulation of capital. And the idea was, how did capitalism come into being? It's a very interesting question. How did capitalism come into being? How did you suddenly have a situation where there are a whole lot of fellows employed as workers and a whole lot of fellows who actually have a lot of capital? Smith's argument was that this came about because you start from a world of more or less equal producers. Some are thrifty, they save, they don't consume, they actually save, and therefore build up larger and larger amounts of resources at their command. Okay. Now, when they do so, then they can employ the others who are less thrifty, but the employment of these others means that they are also better off being employed as workers than they would have been as small producers. Am I making myself clear? By the way, this is also the defense of the enclosures by political philosophers like John Locke. John Locke's defense of enclosure, and his theory of social contract was based upon this, is that, look, when the landlord enclosed that bit of land and said, this is mine, he did so, and that land productivity increased so much that actually the others who are excluded would be better off being employed by that landlord. I mean, if not immediately, over time. Okay. So the whole idea of the liberal conception was that the emergence of capitalism was one that actually made everybody better off. Okay. Including the workers and including the capitalists. So the emergence of capital was not at the expense of petty producers, but in fact the emergence of capital created even better conditions for some petty producers who preferred to become workers. Okay. Now, as opposed to this, the notion then from this follows the idea of the individual subject, that, everybody voluntarily decides to participate in the market. Everybody voluntarily decides to become a worker. Everybody voluntarily decides to, participate in this entire economic system. All economic agents are free agents. Okay. As opposed to this, the Marxian notion is that actually primitive accumulation of capital was an act of coercion. Of course, colonialism we know was an act of coercion, but even internal primitive accumulation of capital was an act of coercion. It produces a set of proletarians who actually had nothing. And it did so and set up a system in which you actually had this kind of social relationship between capitalists and workers getting reproduced over time, so that the proletarians remain proletarians and the capitalists remain capitalists. In other words, the system operates in such a way as to reproduce the social relationship. And what is more, this is a system in which everybody is alienated. The capitalist is also alienated because the capitalist is caught in a Darwinian competitive struggle that you accumulate. If you don't accumulate, someone else is going to take over your market. And as a result, as opposed to individual agents, free agents, it is one of universal alienation. And if that is the case, then the only way to get out of this alienation and to acquire freedom is by overthrowing the system, which is a socialist argument. Well, the liberal argument is that no, this is a system which is essentially one characterized by individual freedom, and it may have problems, but then those problems can be overcome through reforms. Okay. Yeah, please.
One, I'm very grateful to you for bringing the ideal form of generalized commodity production into the foreground. I'm very grateful to you. And otherwise, to make petty commodity production, pretty commodity production. That's beautiful, it's worthwhile, it's just. Unfortunately, we study in constitutional law somebody called Ambedkar. And Ambedkar was utterly opposed to Mohandas Gandhi's idea of Ramarajya and village republics, as you know. And he said, what's a village? I quote from my heart. He said, a village is not a republic, it's a den, it's a stinking den of prejudice against untouchables. A village, I want a liberation from village, that's why I'm also going to liberal constitution. So how do you make petty commodity production into pretty commodity production? Back to a caste society which believes in beating up the untouchables. It's not only violently excluding them, but regularly beating them, lynching them. That's one slight problem with that. And the second, you and I know Sukumar Chakravarti, great economist, theoretician, but very meticulous one. So one day he was a seminar, I was a seminar, and I said, I raised my hand and said, there are two types of GNP. He said, very well, what is it? I said, India has GNP, the gross national product, GNP 1 also rises, GNP 2. He said, what is GNP 2? Gross national poverty. So I said, what kind of development is this? And Sukumar, being a very good economic theoretician, said, wait a minute, who has formulated this economic law? At that time, nobody had, so I said, it's a Bakshi Baron, it's an oxymoron. That's my Bakshi law of economics. But now I say, it is Patnaik law of economics. I've got greater authority to say that, because it is the case that GNP 1 rises, GNP 2 rises. In fact, rises much more than GNP 1. But thank you very much for your comments. And,
thank you very much. Sukhavendra was my teacher, actually, as you know. I learned so much from him. I think this question about Gandhi, it's a very, very difficult and fundamental question. I mean, I think, I'll tell you a story, okay? This story was told to me by both K.N. Raj and Joan Robinson. I mean, for those young people, Joan Robinson was an outstanding 20th century economist, part of the Keynesian revolution, really kind of outstanding economist. She used to come to India quite often. She used to go to Trivandrum, where she would visit a center started by another outstanding Indian economist, Professor K.N. Raj, who was the Vice Chancellor of Delhi University, Professor at Delhi School of Economics, my teacher. He started in a Center for Development Studies. Some of you may know about CDS. It was started by him. Now, Joan Robinson used to go and visit there, and Joan Robinson, and Raj was very friendly with E.M.S. Namboodiripad, the communist leader, and once E.M.S. Namboodiripad was having dinner with Joan Robinson and Raj in Raj's house. And Joan Robinson, being kind of brash English economist, said, EMS, Mao and you started at the same time. The Chinese Communist Party was founded around the same time as the Indian Communist Party. How come they made a revolution, you did not? So EMS apparently didn't say anything. So much so that for a very long time they thought that, he had not heard the question or he didn't want to answer the question. After a very long time, he just said one word, caste. So what you're raising is a very, very fundamental thing. I mean, it worries me greatly. In other words, how can one visualize a defense of petty production and even its, okay, I'm not just talking about a defense of petty production, but I'm really talking about its sublating itself, transcending itself into collective forms, In other words, by its own bootstraps, it lifts itself up to higher levels of organization as well as technological ability and competence and practices and so on, land augmenting. But of course, if you have collective labor augmenting, doesn't matter, because after all, whatever unemployment is generated is not actually unemployment, because it accrues back to the same people through higher profits or higher surplus. But anyway, but on the other hand, given these deep divisions, how can we actually visualize the creation out of it potentially of a new community? It's a very difficult question. But what I do feel is that, okay, land reforms of course are essential. But what I do feel is that I think the assault on of neoliberal capitalism upon the agrarian economy is now so severe that perhaps it might create conditions for the laborers and the peasants to come together and thereby, as it were, have a kind of alliance which is not altogether impossible. At a very trivial and mundane level, the kind of the kind of political alliance you find coming into being in UP, for instance, whatever worth, it is after all in some sense an alliance between segments of the peasantry that the Yadavs represent and segments of the agricultural laborers that Mayawati represents. I'm not saying that it is politically a class alliance or it is an alliance that is going to kind of, sublate itself into a new collective or a new community. But on the other hand, it's not impossible in certain circumstances for different classes to come together. And of course, if that is the case, then one can perhaps take it from there. I don't know, but it's a difficult question. It bothers me greatly. I don't have an answer. I only have a hope. Also, sorry. No, it's all right.
Thank you so much for the insights. I'm Kopil. I'm a PhD fellow in BITS Hyderabad campus. So my question draws from the insight you just discussed about just defending answers from political philosophy. So one of the saying by John Rawls, the difference principle, which legitimizes inequality so long, it advantages the better, the least advantaged.
Right.
So what, in your view, is the underlying assumption, whether it legitimizes inequality or it thinks inequality is inevitable? So how it gets converted to the lower level of operations in the society and how it gets upheld there? Thank you.
Can I again take a couple of questions? Yes, please. Carry on.
Hi, hello sir. I'm Yashasvi from the first year. So you mentioned how controlling the rate of technology growth can be a solution to the surplus of the labor force. In a similar context, how does the influence of foreign players of FDI in India play out in helping or not helping the labor force surplus which is available?
One more I'll take and then let's... Yeah, why don't you?
Sir, my name is Karthik and I'm coming from Kerala and I'm not an Nalsar student. Actually, in Kerala, as you pointed out, there is a great debate between the Ambedkarites and the leftists regarding the concept of caste and class. Yeah. And very recently, a very distinguished economist, may have heard about him, Kunyaman, who is a distinguished professor at TIS. Actually, he in an interview pointed out that for the Dalits, the neoliberal system is much better than what is compared to the social system, because in a neoliberal system, the social mobility will be higher. And he even points out an example that for the caste discrimination that an entrepreneur in Pune is facing is very less than that is compared to an ordinary officer or an official that is in a village. Anyhow, people should come up for him for jobs. And I would like your response.
Yeah. Okay. Let me begin from this question because it's quite interesting. You see, first, I know Kunjaman very well. It's possible that he may have just said it as a kind of, sometimes you say things, in order to emphasize a point, but I don't think he would mean it very seriously. Because one of the things about neoliberalism, for instance, is privatization. And there is no reservation for Dalits in the private sector. So how can you have a situation where Dalits, who, by the way, if you look at all indices, you find that reservations have certainly helped Dalits to some extent. The fact that in basic education and so on, the Dalits' position now is marginally better than that of Muslims is really to do with reservations. Okay, this is not to say that the basic kind of inequalities have disappeared, but they have improved their position somewhat. So if you do away with reservations, which privatization necessarily means, and no government has had the courage to say that let's have reservations in the private sector, because that goes fundamentally against this whole freedom to capital, then how can you say that they are better off under neoliberalism? And what is more, for instance, I gave you these figures about the agricultural sector, where the per capita real income has declined. Now, it stands to reason that when a thing like this happens, it's not the landlords who lose out, it's not the kind of rich peasants who lose out, it's the laborers who lose out, okay? And the laborers are predominantly Dalit, or, Dalits constitute a very significant component of the laborers. Even the little bit of succor that they got through the MGNREGS is now being wound up, So it is not possible I mean, Kunyaman may have said it in a kind of fit of excitement, but on the other hand, I don't think that can possibly be true. But on the other hand, of course, caste remains a very, very, very serious issue. Let me be very, very frank. I mean, as I need hardly say that I am a socialist. Okay, to me, the meaning of socialism in India would be that society where caste has got annihilated. Okay, in other words, I see the transcendence of capitalism as a necessary condition for the annihilation of caste. Okay, that's basically the way I see it. All right, now, yes, you are right about, you see, liberals acknowledge flaws in the system, but they basically believe that the flaws can be rectified. And I would also believe that if I did not have the following view, and let me just, you see, I see the capitalist system as, in quotes, a spontaneous system, in the sense that it's a system in which is driven by an immanent logic of its own, which nobody controls, which nobody can control. I mean, after all, you have for 10 years a financial crisis. Nobody wants it. But why do you have a financial crisis? Because it's driven by immanent tendencies of its own. Keynes, who was a liberal, John Maynard Keynes, the economist, who was a liberal, thought, I mean, he was smart enough to see that the system has its flaws, but he thought you could control the system through the instrumentality of the state. Okay. But on the other hand, I believe that the period in which his policies were put into practice, which was the period immediately after the Second World War, was a period in which capitalism was really on the retreat because of the Second World War, because of the, march of the Red Army across Eastern Europe and all the rest of it, So, because of that, they were, and because of the fact that throughout the Western Europe, the workers simply did not want to go back to the old days. So capitalism required, for its very survival, a certain set of policies, and therefore, in some sense, the state was allowed, if you like, to carry out the kinds of demand management that Keynes had suggested, because of which employment was high. But on the other hand, fairly soon, you had a reassertion of capitalism through, for instance, centralization of capital, creating this internationally mobile capital, which Keynes had been opposed to. The Bretton Woods system he set up advocated capital controls, allowed capital controls, but on the other hand, now capital controls are overcome because capital is globalized. When it's globalized, the state loses its capacity. You can't have a nation state doing what it likes in a world in which finance is globalized, because then if finance doesn't like what's going on, it'll just go to some other country. As a result, you once more have a reassertion of the spontaneity of the system. Okay. Now, if it was the case that the system was not spontaneous, to me, the argument for socialism arises from the spontaneity of the system. That you can't control it. Because you cannot control it, what you require for freedom is a system through which people, by political control, would be able to master their economic destinies. Okay. Now what happens is that because of the spontaneity of economics, the politics itself is governed by the economics. Okay. So Rawls and so on are perfectly right in seeing the problems of capitalism, but on the other hand, there are solutions to these problems, are solutions which don't, to my mind, acknowledge the spontaneity of the system. Or why is it that precisely in the current period, as Piketty and others have been arguing, enormous increases in economic inequality? That's exactly what's happening, because no state can actually adopt egalitarian measures, because then capital would flow somewhere else. You cannot adopt egalitarian measures without having capital controls, and if you have capital control, then you are withdrawn from neoliberal capitalism. Okay, now FDI, but controlling technology growths, shall we say, restraining technology growth, controlling the spontaneity of technology growth is something which necessarily would require controls on FDI, because you can't have FDI in any sector. After all, when we say Walmart is no good, let's not have Walmart. What we have in mind is let's not have FDI in multi-brand retail. So it implies that there has to be some control on foreign domestic investment. So one is just the other side of the same coin.
It's clarification. Production and the industrial. In the context, for example, house farming and government. Where do we place that kind of farming?
Yes.
It's almost like an industry. 50% to 75% from the government. Car from the villages.
Yes.
It's completely arbitrary kind of thing. So.
Yes. In fact, one can carry your argument further that putting out system. If it's a putting out system, then putting out system appears to be petty production, but is under the control of capital. Okay. What I had in mind is traditional petty production, including peasant agriculture. Now, obviously, I think modern capitalism, precisely because the labor reserves are not getting used up, the modern capitalism finds it very easy to garment workers. It actually uses underpaid women in order to have this garment manufacturing, and because of export competitiveness, their standards of living are abysmal. This can be done when they are collected together in a workshop. This can be done even when they are working at home. So when they work at home, that may appear petty production, but it's petty production controlled by capital. So one has to distinguish between different layers, different kinds of petty production. I should have done that, I'm sorry. But I had in mind a really traditional petty production. Okay, I should make that clear. Thank you. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Patnaik, for an extensive and very educational talk. And I hope the students also benefited from it. It must have been a refreshing change from marginal cost, marginal revenues, at least the first years. And definitely for the seminar course on policy issues, where we'll be looking into some of the issues that we've been discussed, for example, land acquisition. Thank you. We end here.